We meet General George Poker Sash, a 104-year-old veteran of the Civil War, who is invited as a guest of honor at his granddaughter's graduation. Though extraordinarily proud of himself and his accomplishments, General Sash cannot actually remember his past actions with the Confederate Army. His profane language, some of which we have edited for content, if you read Flannery O'Connor, you know, reveals the bent character of his soul and the way that those who turn their backs on the past are sure to be haunted by it. Please welcome Madi Drotter.
The graduates were lined up behind the science building, and Sally Poker found her place just as the line started to move. She had not slept much the night before, and when she had dreamed of the exercises, murmuring, see him in her sleep, but waking up every time just before she turned her head to look at him behind her. The graduates had to walk 3 blocks in the hot sun in their black wool robes, and as she plodded stolidly along, she thought that if anyone considered this academic procession something impressive to behold, they need only wait until they saw that old general in his courageous gray, and that clean young Boy Scout stoutly wheeling his chair across the stage with the sunlight catching the sword. She imagined John Wesley had the old man ready now behind the stage. The black procession wound its way up the 2 blocks and started on the main walk leading to the auditorium. The visitors stood on the grass, picking out their graduates. Men were pushing back their hats and wiping their foreheads, and women were lifting their dresses slightly from the shoulders to keep them from sticking to their backs. The graduates in their heavy robes looked as if the last beads of ignorance were being sweated out of them. The sun blazed off the fenders of automobiles and beat from the columns of the buildings and pulled the eye from one spot of glare to another. It pulled Sally Poker's toward the big red Coca-Cola machine that had been set up by the side of the auditorium. Here she saw the general parked, scowling and hatless in his chair in the blazing sun, while John Wesley, his blouse loose behind, his hip and cheek pressed the red machine, was drinking a Coca-Cola. She broke from the line and galloped to them and snatched the bottle away. She shook the boy and thrust in his blouse and put the hat on the old man's head. Now get him in there, she said, pointing one rigid finger to the side door of the building. For his part, the general felt as if there were a little hole beginning to widen in the top of his head. The boy wheeled him rapidly down a walk and up a ramp and into the building and bumped him over the stage entrance and into position where he had been told. And the general glared in front of him at heads that all seemed to flow together and eyes that moved from one face to another. Several figures in black robes came and picked up his hand and shook it. A black procession was flowing up each aisle and forming to stately music in a pool in front of him. The music seemed to be entering his head through the little hole, and he thought for a second the procession would try to enter it too. He didn't know what procession this was, but there was something familiar about it. It must be familiar to him since it had come to meet him, but he didn't like a black procession. Any procession that came to meet him, he thought irritably, ought to have floats with beautiful girls on them like the ones before the preemie. It must be something connected with history like they were always having. He had no use for any of it. What happened then wasn't anything to a man living now, and he was living now. When all the procession had flowed into the black pool, a black figure began orating in front of it. The figure was telling something about history, and the general made up his mind he wouldn't listen. But the words kept seeping in through the little hole in his head. He heard his own name mentioned, and his chair was shuttled forward roughly, and the Boy Scout took a big bow. They called his name, and the fat brat bowed. Damn you, the old man tried to say. Get out of my way, I can stand up. But he was jerked back again before he could get up and take the bow. He supposed the noise they made was for him. If he was over now, he didn't intend to listen to any more of it. If it hadn't been for the little hole in the top of his head, none of the words would have got to him. Thought of putting a finger up there into the hole to block them. But the hole was a little wider than his finger, and it felt as if it were getting deeper. Another black robe had taken the place of the first one and was talking now, and he heard his name mentioned again, but they were not talking about him, they were still talking about history. If we forget our past, the speaker was saying, we won't remember our future, and it will be as well, for we won't have one. The general heard some of these words gradually. He had forgotten the history, and he didn't intend to remember it. He had forgotten the name and face of his wife, and the names and faces of his children, or even if he had a wife and children. And he had forgotten the names of places and the places themselves, what had happened at them. He was considerably irked by the hole in his head. He had not expected to have a hole in his head at this event. It was the slow, black music that had put it there, and though most of the music had stopped outside, there was still a little of it in the hole, going deeper and moving around in his thoughts, letting the words he heard into the dark places of his brain. He heard the words, Chickamauga, Shiloh, Johnston, Lee, and he knew he was the one inspiring all these words that meant nothing to him. He wondered if he had been a general at Chickamauga or at Lee. Then he tried to see himself and the horse in the middle of a float full of beautiful girls being driven slowly through downtown Atlanta. Instead, the old words began to stir in his head, as if they were trying to wrench themselves out of place and come to life. The speaker was through with that war and had gone on to the next one, and now he was approaching another, and all his words, like the black procession, were vaguely familiar and irritating. There was a long finger of music in the general's head, probing various spots that were words, letting in a little light on the words and helping them to live. Then the words began to come toward him, and he said, "Stop, damn it, I ain't gonna have it." He started edging backwards to get out of the way. Then he saw the figure in the black robe sit down, and there was a noise, and the black pool in front of him began to rumble and to flow toward him from either side to the black, slow music. And he said, "Stop, damn it, I can't do but one thing at a time." He couldn't protect himself from the words and attend to the procession too, and the words were coming at him fast. He felt that he was running backwards, and the words were coming at him like musket fire, just escaping him but getting nearer and nearer. He turned around and began to run as fast as he could, but he found himself running toward the words. He was running into a regular volley of them, meeting them with quick curses. As the music swelled toward him, the entire past opened up on him out of nowhere, and he felt his body riddled in 100 places with sharp stabs of pain, and he fell down, returning a curse for every hit. He saw his wife's narrow face, looking at him critically through her round, gold-rimmed glasses. he saw one of his squinting, bald-headed sons. And his mother ran toward him with an anxious look. Then a succession of places. Chickamauga, Shiloh, Marthasville, rushed toward him as if the past were the only future now and he had to endure it. Then suddenly he saw that the black procession was almost on him. He recognized it, for it had been dogging all his days. He made such a desperate effort to see over it and to find out what comes after the past that his hand clenched the sword until the blade touched bone. The graduates were crossing the stage in a long file to receive their scrolls and shake the president's hand. As Sally Poker, who was near the end, crossed, she glanced over at the general and saw him sitting fixed and fierce, his eyes wide open. And she turned her head forward again and held it a perceptible degree higher and received her scroll. After it was all over, and she was out of the auditorium in the sun again, she located her kin and they waited together on a bench in the shade for John Wesley to wheel the old man out. That crafty scout had bumped him out the back way and rolled him at high speed down a flagstone path and was waiting now with the corpse in the long line for the Coca-Cola machine.